Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor. This is the podcast for all the most important, interesting, exciting, but also controversial events in the life and history of the Roman Catholic Church. I am Derek Taylor, your host for the podcast. Thank you all again for listening. Thank you to all the listeners out there and to our patrons on Patreon, as always. You can find Controversies in Church History on the web at churchcontroversies.com, on social media, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And as I mentioned before, you can become a patron of the podcast if you so wish. Do check out our website. We have content up on there, blog posts, links to my writings. I have a new article out yesterday, in Crisis Magazine called The Last Temptation of the Lay Apologist. It's about the temptations of being a lay apologist for the faith in this day and age. So take a look at it there. We'll also have a very long article coming out, I think, at the end of next week, or end of August, which will be next week, on the critics of the First Vatican Council. I wrote an article for the traditionalist website, 1 Peter 5, going through what the critics of the definition of papal infallibility and primacy at that council, what their criticisms were, and sort of evaluating them for historical reasons, but also for current reasons. There are people, of course, who are objecting to the way the current pontificate uses its authority, and so I'm bringing that into play and talking about Vatican I and how it played into that. So that stuff's coming up. But today, this is a single episode, and it's one of these review episodes where I go back and take a look at films, which I've been doing lately, but sometimes books. And this is a book that's kind of heady. It's a book called God Owes Us Nothing. Maybe the greatest title for a book ever. I don't know. Now, I've always loved the title of the book, for a variety of reasons, but God Owes Us Nothing was by the Polish philosopher, and I don't have his dates. He's passed away. I think 2011, perhaps, maybe, in the last 10 years or so. Lezsek Kolakowski, a Polish philosopher, who I'll get to in a moment. I'll talk about his background. But he wrote this book in 1995, which the subtitle of the book, by the way, is God Owes Us Nothing, a brief remark on the Religion of Pascal and the Spirit of Jansenism. And so it's about this 17th century movement. If you don't know what Jansenism is, I'll describe it briefly here. Jansenism, I actually have a podcast on that. You can go back and look at it. It's actually I did a live stream. I was live streaming that one. Jansenism was a 17th century movement within the Catholic Church in France, which, for a variety of reasons, the sort of founder of this movement was a guy named Jansenius, who was a bishop of Ypres in the sort of Protestant, Dutch, French border country, and wrote a big tome basically arguing that the doctrine of Augustine meant that grace was irresistible, and this sounded a lot like Protestantism to some of his contemporaries, and in particularly those who defended free will in regards to salvation. Can we do anything to contribute to our salvation? And his followers were a group of very pious people, very devout, but also very learned. The Jansenists were effectively people who were actually involved in these debates. Were people like Blaise Pascal. That's the person referenced in the title of that book. Pascal was a mathematician and a scientist, actually, who also became a Jansenist. He had a conversion experience, as it were, and became a follower of Jansenists. And the main body of people, actually a family, several family members, the Arnaud family in France, conducted pamphlet wars with the Jesuits. And one of the things, this idea of the irresistibility of grace goes to is, if you got caught up in things like, issues of communion, right? Now, today we have these communion wars. We don't want people taking communion if they've been sinning mortal sin. Well, this was the kind of thing that the Jansenists took this idea, irresistibility of grace. So literally, they began to, advocate a very rigorous notion of, who could take the sacraments. For example, later on today, St. Pius X would encourage frequent communion. They discouraged it. They said they thought most people were sinful, so they shouldn't do it. They were concerned people would take communion unworthily and damn themselves. One famous tract, Antoine Arnaud is the most famous of this Arnaud family, who were these Jansenists, criticized a well-known nobleman in 17th century France who had gone to confession and then immediately went from confession after he'd been absolved to a ball, to a dance party, as being a sinful thing. So it's a very rigorous sort of way of looking at the faith. But these are very devout people. They practiced a very severe but very sincere piety, and they attracted a lot of followers. And in fact, the Jansenists, in a lot of ways, attracted people who didn't really have much to do with their controversial ideas. A lot of people who were devout in 17th century France just wanted a sort of devout, more austere form of the faith. And so one of the things that happens with Jansenism long term is it kind of gets condemned by the papacy for a variety of reasons. I won't go into this here. You can go check out my podcast episode on it. And the condemnations are kind of poorly worded. And they wind up, it's possible they wind up condemning what were otherwise perfectly orthodox statements that go back to Augustine. That's one of the things, by the way, it's still debated about the Jansenists. I don't know if this has ever been settled. Jansenius thought that he had described Augustine's work perfectly. And again, this touched a nerve, of course, in the 17th century, because that's what the Protestant reformers thought they were doing. Luther, Calvin, their whole ideas of, double predestination and all that stuff. And from what I understand to this day, there's not an agreement on this among scholars. I know there was one scholar back in the 30s who basically said that no, Jansenius got it wrong. A more recent scholar has basically defended him. So I don't know if he was actually right about that issue, but it caused conflict. And it caused conflict partly because you had this, 17th century's era of the 30 Years' War, the collapse, really, the final collapse of united Christendom into, permanently Protestant and Catholic camps, and the emergence of things like modern science. And so this is sometimes seen as emblematic of this, the Jansenists wanting to insist upon a very, perfect notion of the faith, perfection, right? Moral rigorism and perfection, in the face of a modern society that's becoming wealthy and embracing science and doesn't want to do that stuff anymore. So all this stuff is in the background with Jansenism. And it's directly addressed in this book by Lezsek Kolakowski. I'll come back to the book in a minute. I want to talk about his background for a second. Kolakowski's, he's Polish, obviously. And he had a rough life, at least rough upbringing. If you ever see a picture of the man, he looks he looks like a vampire or something. He's just really gaunt. He was a very unhappy person. You get this reading his work. He's a very unhappy person in a lot of ways. For unfortunately good reasons. He was born in 1927 in Poland. His father was a left-wing political activist in Poland, a very secular one in a very religious country. So secular he was never baptized. His mother died of cancer in 1930 when he was 3. His father, because of course, famously the Nazis invaded Poland, his father was arrested and then tortured to death by the Gestapo in 1943. And then they took his body, poured gasoline on it, and burned it up. So, by the time the war ends in 1945, the Soviet Union, the Russians come in, take over the country. This is his life, his first, 18 years of life. And in fact, he becomes a member of the Communist Party. And in fact, he becomes a star, in fact, in the sort of Soviet intelligentsia, or the communist intelligentsia in Poland anyway. His bleak outlook on life was basically, had one exception, that was communism. He saw communism and Marx's ideas as the culmination of the Enlightenment, doing away with superstition, leading toward reason and rationality. He accepted the basic understanding of Soviet communism at the time, that it was the fulfillment of a scientific view of history, that history is moving scientifically toward this, materialist utopia. without a lot of morality in it. And this sets up what happens with him because, by 1950 he's doing graduate work as a philosopher, and the one institution, of course, that opposed the party in Poland after the war was the Catholic Church. And so he took aim at the church. And he actually began, this, by the way, was someone who was actually could read Latin fluently, even though he was not raised in a secular household. Studied Aquinas in order to critique him. Was going to do his dissertation on that, changed his mind. Decided to study the works of Baruch Spinoza. Changed his mind again. He changed his mind a lot, is the point, for a lot of reasons. But as he began to do this, to go through these changes of mind, Kolakowski began to see problems with the sort of Marxist worldview he'd inherited. In particular, he had things. Travel kind of disillusioned him. He went to Moscow and he saw what it was like there, and they didn't seem to be. The Soviets were much better off than the Poles intellectually. They were far worse than the Poles in a lot of ways. And basically he found just nothingness there. And eventually you have a thaw within the Soviet Union after Stalin dies in 1956. He's privately denounced at a party meeting. And people begin to speak out about, the awful things that Stalin did while he was alive. And so he also he was influenced by this study he was doing of Christianity, but also by a guy named Lucien Goldman. I mentioned him for a second because he's connected to the book, which I'll get to in a minute, I promise. This explains a lot in the book when I get to it. And this guy, Lucien Goldman, was a French Marxist. And he wrote a book in 1955 called The Hidden God, which was about the Jansenists. And this is why it influenced Kolakowski, is that he was saying that Goldman said the Enlightenment was an advance in some ways, but it was also a retreat. And the reason why is that when you go from a Christian transcendental worldview to a scientific one, it drains the world of meaning. It drains the world, particularly of morality, the moral virtues that make human life what it's supposed to be are done away with. And so socialism or Marxism, as the completion of the Enlightenment, is actually its undermining, because it returns the human being to the center of the universe. And so this is where Goldman takes up the Jansenists and Blaise Pascal, who basically, if you know Pascal's famous wager, the idea of it's certain we're going to die, so why don't we make this choice to believe in God and everything. This sort of I put this modern-sounding redemptive faith in the shadow of sort of certain death, through whatever science or whatever. And so this idea had a real profound effect on Kolakowski, and he began to become critical of the in his writings of the party, of Marxism. He gained, made him famous this for a lot of reasons. Eventually, this led to him becoming even more critical by the 1960s, such that his phone was tapped, people were spying on him, and by 1966, he'd come to basically articulate that, you had to have this, humanism. You had to humanize Marxism if you're going to save it. But he began to actually introduce theological language into his writing in the 1960s. Things like, sin, salvation, grace, were describing real things in his mind. And in fact, he wrote a famous article in 1959 called "The Jester and the Priest." And this idea of his was that basically there are two types, effectively, social types, if you like, sociological types in a Marxist view of the world. A priest who is a rule maker, who's the guardian of the absolute, and a jester who is the outsider who resists any sort of absolute tyranny or whatever. And this is very much characteristic of a lot of his thinking. He goes back and forth between these poles. He has a very either or way of like going about making his arguments. He doesn't actually come to a conclusion like that, though. He conducts his arguments that way. I said by the 1960s, he began basically saying that religion was ineradicable from human life, effectively. And what happened was he was beginning to take the side of the people who had been criticizing, the Christians. Began arguing that religion was basically an ineradicable sort of reality of human life, without which that human moral virtues and reason would be sort of inexplicable. And in fact, one of his essays in the 1960s was actually quoted by the Archbishop of Krakow in one of his sermons. That Archbishop of Krakow would be, of course, Karol Wojtyła, the future John Paul II. And so he began criticizing Marxism so much he was eventually his books were refused publication. He gave a lecture attacking the government. He was condemned within the press. He was expelled from the party, lost all his jobs. And then he fled to the West in 1968. Wound up at All Souls College, Oxford, eventually broke with Marxism completely by 1973. Beginning publishing a 3-volume work called The Main Currents of Marxism, where he basically trashed a lot of his former heroes, Marx, Lenin, Goldman, but also himself. And basically denouncing the whole idea of a rational, ordered world that the Enlightenment had come up with, claiming it was a matter of, utopian, what he called self-deification, a refusal to accept things like contingency. All this stuff led naturally to the gulags. And the thing is, he began to side culturally and politically with the more conservative. He came to know as a conservative Catholic commentary, even though he was always coy about his actual beliefs. Nevertheless, despite this, he was convinced that, as he put it in 1982, the absence of God spells the ruin of man, unquote. And in fact, he became fairly close, actually, at one point to John Paul II. When John Paul II became Pope in 1978, he invited him to meet him. A little story here when Lezsek Kolakowski basically thanked him for making time to meet him. He said, the Pope carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. John Paul II replied, "We all carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, Lezsek." And that's a little story there. But in fact, he actually became a frequent visitor from 1982 to the year 2000. He came. He visited John Paul II every month at the Castel Gandolfo in Rome to discuss, philosophical matters and everything. And he had lots of disagreements with John Paul II. In particular, the biggest thing about him, again, he embraced this sort of darker view of the world by this point, and he'd seen a lot of evil, so he thought the reality of evil is one of the fundamental things in this world. But he thought that, in a couple of ways, he thought that John Paul II was wrong about, in terms of his belief that faith and reason could be reconciled. He thought this was utopian or semi-Pelagian. In particular, he thought the belief in human goodness was deeply flawed. Again, given his life experiences, you can kind of understand why. And this is what, and this is the kind of thinking that's in the background of his mind when he, wrote "God Owes Us Nothing" in 1995. Now, what this refers to, by the way, the title, if you're wondering where the title, I explained the title about Jansenism earlier, "God Owes Us Nothing." This is about, this is his description of the Jansenist or any I guess whatever Jansenist or Calvinist view of the world that views us as sort of we're subject to a virtually unknowable God, right? The unknown God. This is a big thing with Luther, right? Who we can't understand and who totally has power over us. The idea is that God is so powerful, so beyond human comprehension, he simply doesn't have any moral responsibilities towards us. Literally, he has no moral obligations toward anyone. Hence, God owes us nothing. That's the sort of very severe, transcendent type of deity that he thinks, and I don't know if I necessarily agree, we'll get this in a second, about that the Jansenists had in mind. So let's talk about the book a little bit here. In the book, again, given his you can see his his worldview, why he'd be concerned about this. Because what he's essentially concerned about is theodicy, how to reconcile God's goodness and justice with the existence of evil in the world. It's the only time, as far as I'm aware, Kolakowski ever. This is really. He's a philosopher. This is more about theology, although he's really taking, from my reading of it, from his experience of being a Marxist. But the book was intended to show that Pascal and the Jansenists, and by extension the Protestant Reformers, I guess, believed what the church up until then had always believed about predestination, and that the church had somehow abandoned it by condemning them, because they did condemn Pascal. They condemned the idea that you were totally, again, Council of Trent said, you do have some sort of freedom of will with regard to salvation. On the other hand, he basically, and I say this, he said that's what he's saying. He's basically saying the church was right, that it needed to update and adapt its teachings to modern times. He wanted to show that Pascal and the Jansenists were wrong to be as rigorous as they were, and what they needed was, and again, he's not totally. When I say that, I don't mean to be so certain about this, because he is this very subtle thinker. He was used to writing, by the way, under a totalitarian regime, so he is kind of being coy about a lot of what he thinks, but he says stuff like this, trust me, in the actual book. What the church needed was a theology that could adapt itself to a new civilization. The church had once been made up of saints, but they really couldn't do that anymore. It was no longer going to be a church of saints, it was a group of the perfect, like the Jansenists wanted to be. And in this, he really treats this whole debate over freedom of will to be an either-or problem. I mentioned that earlier. That's one of the I think important characteristics of his thinking. And he actually accuses both Thomas Aquinas and Trent as being ambiguous on the matter. Anything but complete freedom of will or complete, I guess, necessity is just hedging your bets to him, or was. And again, he wasn't a theologian, so he ignores certain things. He doesn't talk, by the way, about, for example, the doctrine of sanctification at all, from what I can remember of the book. And so he doesn't talk about, again, that sort of middle position the church essentially takes, that God's grace can regenerate us, make us capable of cooperating with him. He thinks that's just a cop-out in a lot of ways. He also, and again, I'm not sure about this because I mentioned this before, at several places in the book, seems to basically conflate what Augustine said about grace, what the Jansenists said about grace, what Luther and Calvin said about grace. And I'm just not sure that's actually accurate in a lot of ways. And again, one of these things he's thinking about, again, obviously in this book, is the 17th century growth of science. The idea that before science you could believe somehow in the idea of moral perfection, but now it's become suspect. That modern people who are who are into pleasure and stuff like this are never going to sort of believe in that sort of thing, I guess. And he very subtly, on the one hand, I say that I think he's overdoing it on purpose, because I think he wants there to be something like the Jansenists believe in, but he knows what people really want, for the most part, is what the Jesuits basically offered them, which was kind of a comforting way to salvation for the emerging middle classes of early modern Europe. And so, by extension, he's basically, I don't know if he's condemning or agreeing with the church on this, but basically saying that the church, by condemning Jansenism, implicitly rejects Augustine, embraces, the Jesuits, and implicitly the modern world, I think. Interesting book. And he also has fascinating things to say about the psychology of Jansenism, things that I think I used to think were a little off. I think they're basically correct at this point in my life. I've changed my mind about the book several times. He basically says Pascal and the Jansenists were basically excessively morbid, harsh, that the reason for the harshness of their faith was more psychological than theological. The last line of the book is, it was a faith for unhappy people designed to make them more unhappy. I guess the idea is that the sign that they're one of the elect is that they are unhappy, and so to make yourself more distinguished as the elect, you have to make yourself more unhappy, I guess. And it is true, by the way. If you know anything about Pascal, Pascal was someone who suffered from physical ailments, probably I think from depression, from I've noted the man. And if you know anything about like the Jansenists, it's a very not just austere. It's in some ways kind of sickly in a lot of ways. Their piety. There was a painter, I think his name was Nicolas Poussin, who was a Jansenist. And if you go to you just Google his name. I think there still is. When I was living in Kansas City, Missouri, in the Nelson Atkins Museum in that city, a painting by this guy. And it's a painting of the crucifixion, Christ on the cross. And the painting is really dour. It's Christ on the cross, all alone. There's no other figures in the painting. The background is like against a dark, ominous sky. It very much captures that kind of. There is a side to Jansenism that is just, you wonder if these people, just needed some antidepressants or something. Nonetheless, I've always found the book fascinating, even though he's dealing with these, very. It's very, I don't want to say dark, but it's very difficult ideas. Theodicy is a huge thing, right? How do you solve that? I'm not a philosopher. I couldn't tell you. I'm definitely not a theologian. And yeah, I mean, this idea that God owes us nothing, and again, we're in this world, and apparently by the end of his life, he had this very bleak view of the world, that we're basically governed by a God we can't know and understand, and again, in a world that's this harsh, can be this evil. It's a real hard sort of belief to sort of to put your faith in. But what's interesting is he makes these accusations against the Jansenists. If you don't know, this accusation gets thrown against people in the modern church, in the contemporary church, when people want to accuse contemporary, usually conservative or traditionalist of Catholics of being too rigorous. They'll sometimes hurl the epithet Jansenist at them, as if it's not possible for people to, to fulfill the church's commandments about things like adultery and stuff like this. It obviously refers to stuff about communion that's been going on, especially since Pope Francis became pontiff. And it's just an interesting. It's almost hard to know exactly what he thinks, actually, in some ways. But it speaks to how the Jansenists still kind of speak to us in a lot of ways. Pascal, for example, is very modern in the fact that he's someone who's a scientist and who saw his faith as the center of his life, had trouble reconciling it with what his science was telling him about the natural world. Have you ever read his pensées? His pensées are definitely worth reading. I used to be really into Pascal. I'll stop here and give you this personal anecdote. And I first read Pascal and this book, actually, God Owes Us Nothing, years ago when I was still living in Gainesville, Florida, and I think it was when I was in my master's degree there at the University of Florida. And it was actually, I believe, for okay, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Oh, I read Pascal in this book because I attended some lectures at the Christian Studies Center of Gainesville. If you don't know what this is, it's a sort of intellectual center for, it's mostly Protestants as far as I could tell. I had not. I think I attended these before I became Catholic. I became Catholic in 2003, probably 2001, 2002, something like that. I was there, and Pascal and Jansenism sound, I guess, close enough to Protestantism, so they're easier for them to take, I guess. But came to that, reading that book through that experience, and. I didn't know at the time when I was reading Pascal and reading this book by this kind of dark book in some ways by Kolakowski, is that I myself had serious depression, later diagnosed with it, and I kind of gotten off of it. And my point is, I used to really, and I still really appreciate Pascal. I think you probably shouldn't read it that much if you're depressed. It's not going to make you more happy, I can tell you that. It's very fascinating stuff in a lot of ways, especially Pascal's Pensées. There's nothing too bad in there, but it's very it has this kind of a morbidity about it, I think. And I mention all this because this idea of Kolakowski's that, God owes us nothing. God is this totally, incomprehensible, all-powerful being who just doesn't owe us anything. There's something attractive about that. If you're suffering from things like depression, it's nice to know that there's some being in the universe who's all-powerful. Because I think you feel powerless. I did. You feel powerless when you're depressed all the time. And the idea that God doesn't owe us anything, and we can't restrain him by any sort of, he doesn't have any obligations to us, I guess made sense to me at the time. I think when you're suffering, you want a God who's all powerful to sort of like punch a hole through the universe, reason and order and nature be damned, just, make the suffering go away, I think. I mention all this because I got into an argument with a friend of mine one time who was a theologian. I won't mention his name because I don't want him associated with this podcast because my views are kind of traditionalist, and I don't think he is. I don't want him being associated with this, but I remember getting an argument about this with him, and I mentioned this idea, and like he was really opposed to it, thought it was wrong, and I basically insisted he was wrong, and I realize now that I was completely wrong about this, actually, when you think about it, because this desire to have this totally free God who has no obligations, it kind of cuts against God's goodness, because it's true, by nature, God is all-powerful, right? We literally can't make claims on him by nature, but if you believe in the Christian revelation that Jesus of Nazareth really was God on earth, God revealed himself to us and reached out to us and revealed something to us. And this is the other thing, he made promises to us. And, God, if he really is perfect and all these other things, can't fail to keep his promises. So where I sort of worked my way through that because I was, you're depressed for lots of reasons, right? And part of it is, there are evils in your life that don't go away. I must say, I'm a very much more happy person than I used to be. I'm very grateful for my life. Not every evil ever, not ever goes away, but sometimes it doesn't. That doesn't mean God hasn't fulfilled what he promised. And that's where I had to go back in my life and think very carefully. All my experiences of prayer, what's in the scripture, what's in tradition. I think sometimes we confuse those things, what God owes us, and that's kind of why. And it's someone like Kolakowski, who had, it's pretty rough, his life. Well, John Paul II had a rough, upbringing, in Poland like that as well. When you're so sensitive to the evils in the world, can seem, the whole idea of reconciling reason and faith and stuff like this just seems. I guess it seemed to me at the time, it seemed superficial, right? It didn't seem to cope with the reality of the things I was experiencing. But you have to look at reality a little differently, give it a different sort of attention, I think. And if I have, again, my problem with Kolakowski is that, again, he's a philosopher in the book. I'd say that, he claims at one point in the book to say that the new world, quote unquote, of the 17th century and modernity made it a, quote, a hopeless task to, quote, to convince people, quote, to stifle their curiosity and their mundane interest, unquote, in order to live up to the demands of the Gospels. Now, look, sometimes we won't be able to do this, but to live up to the Gospel's demands. Doesn't mean we will always be like that. And the idea, it's, what I realized as I got older is these are the counsels of despair, right? The world is so utterly changed that, God's promises in those Gospels just no longer have force. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Not only does it make any sense, it doesn't, you can get so wrapped up. I'm the kind of person, I like powerful experiences, even if they're depressing and awful. And sometimes you can get kind of mesmerized by it. Other experiences in your life tell you something very different. And I think that's the big criticism. I think he looks at these things. And again, he's writing in a certain milieu. He was worried, by the way, really worried, actually. You can tell from the book about where Poland was headed after the fall of communism. So was John Paul II. People seem to be, losing grip on religion. From what I understand, even though Poland is still much higher in sort of religious practice and and attendance and membership in other European countries. It's still declining, so he would like to be concerned about that. But it's just interesting that people, latch on to this 17th century movement, because we are still kind of living with some of those. Well, first of all, you're always living with the problem of evil, I guess, in a way. But also this problem of, okay, based on that, do we reject, reason? Because if you embrace this voluntaristic view of the world, and by voluntarist I mean based on the will, right? This is this idea, what theological voluntarism is. If you don't know these, I don't mean to drop all these abstract terms on you, but it just means that God is primarily defined by his will and not his reason. The most extreme version of this idea is that basically whatever God wills is good, irrespective of how reasonable it is. It's like the old Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma this is the dilemma proposed by Plato, ancient world. Is something good because the gods willed it, or did the gods will it because it was good? In other words, is there some standard of goodness independent of the God's will? And so you put this in the Christian context, there are some people who want to emphasize, his will to a great degree. No one, at least not many people as far as I'm aware, have ever gone, because if you take that to its logical extreme, it means whatever God wants, no matter what it is. It means basically if God declared that pedophilia was good, it'd be good. That's literally what it would mean. Anything he declared to be good would be. And, anything, he could overturn natural law whenever he felt like it. He could overturn revelation. He could change his mind, right? It didn't matter. His will is everything. The other vision of God is, and again, most people, when they take the voluntaristic view, don't take that view. Let me be clear. That's the extreme view. But the reason why they take a voluntaristic line on God is it tends to emphasize his solicitude toward human beings, right? When I say voluntaristic or will, they usually mean like his love for mankind. Usually it's taken as his love for mankind that way. But it can be taken in a darker sense. In what I know of Islamic theology, that's more or less how they view him. In the Quran, there are passages where it basically says God can change, he can change passages of his revelation if he wants to. But of course, the other view is that God is sort of reason himself, right? And he is kind of bound by the precepts. He can't violate things like that. And, this is where Kolakowski disagreed with John Paul II. I think perhaps John Paul II was on shakier ground when he thought you could reconcile certain parts of the modern world to Catholicism. Human rights, democracy, all that stuff. Can that stuff be totally done that way, or other things? But faith and reason, I think in some ways they actually go together naturally. But it is our sin in this world that makes them separate and makes evil so overwhelming. And this idea, of Kolakowski's, it has one virtue: it makes things simple, right? You no longer have to, because it's a lot of work reconciling faith and reason. Excuse me, I said face and reason. Right? Let me reconcile my face with reason. I don't think I can do that anymore. I'm 45. No, reconcile faith and reason, right? By just waving the problem away. There is no reconciling faith and reason. Hell, it's almost like there is no reason at all, really. But I don't think it works ultimately, even though it makes you. The book made me think. I have to say, I've been thinking about it for years, so I give it that credit. I give credit, by the way, to the people at the study center, which is still in existence, by the way. I've never been back there in years, but made me think about this stuff. And interesting things, of course, about the Jansenists as well. Again, I've had my say on this. You can listen to that podcast, but I'm not really sure the Jansenists should be used like this. They lived in a different time period, different historical setting than we did. I know we still dealing with the same problems they did. They were right to identify some of these things, Pascal especially, but I think sometimes people use the Jansenists as a Rorschach blot for ecclesiastical controversy. Is not the best thing in the world. But still a fascinating subject and a fascinating take on them by Lezsek Kolakowski. I think I'm pronouncing that the right. I don't do Polish names. I apologize to any Polish people listening to this. My apologies. His book, God Owes Us Nothing. If you had the stomach for it, I could recommend it as a thoughtful work on a very difficult subject. And so that is it for this episode of Controversies in Church History. If you enjoyed it, Remember, find us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, YouTube, and on the web, churchcontroversies.com, as well as if you would like to become a patron of the podcast on Patreon as well, which is not necessary, by the way. With a few exceptions, there'll be a few things I do bonus material for patrons. I will do some stuff for them. Pretty much everything else will be available free to everybody, so don't worry too much about that. And speaking of that, upcoming, a few more episodes. Everyone will get this episode. There will be a bonus episode for patrons soon, episode. And then also the next episode in the series on Latinization of the Eastern Rites. This is the biggie in the early modern world, the Latinization of the St. Thomas Christians. So look for that fairly soon. My semester starts. The school I teach has already started. It doesn't start for me until the 18th of September, so I'm trying to get that out before then. Things will slow down, as I mentioned before, after that. But I have some things. I'll give you some content, stuff from the blog, read some articles and stuff like that going forward. And oh yes, for patrons, this is the interview stuff is for patrons. I have lined up my first guest. So this will be a video interview, will be coming, you'll see it. Maybe eventually we'll do the stuff live if we get enough people interested, but that is coming. And so hopefully the topics, as we'll see, we're getting ironed out, will interest you. So that's all upcoming on Controversies in Church History. I want to thank everybody again, all my listeners. God bless you for your support. I hope these things are helpful for you, give you stuff to think about. At least while you're driving, so I'm going to give you something to distract you anyway. And in any case, everyone have a wonderful week. And God bless you and fill you with all good things. Take care and talk to you soon.